In May of 1735, a quiet coastal settlement in Kingston, New Hampshire, was struck by an invisible horror. It began not with a dramatic collapse or a bloody wound, but with a simple, ordinary cough. A single child came down with what looked like a mild spring cold. But within 3 days, that child was dead. Within weeks, the mysterious illness tore through neighboring towns like an invading army. It bypassed the elderly and the battle-hardened soldiers. Instead, it hunted the most vulnerable. Families watched in absolute terror as all of their children, one by one, suffocated in their beds. In the town of Ipswich, a man named Mark Howe and his wife watched all 8 of their children die in a single month. A neighbor's family suffered the exact same fate. Entire households were wiped clean of their future in a matter of days. By the time this nightmare slowed down, over 5,000 people were dead across New England, out of a population of just 200,000, and nearly 98% of them were children. The colonists didn't have a scientific name for it. They didn't know how it spread, and they had no way to stop it. To them, it was a supernatural executioner. They called it the strangling angel. To understand the sheer panic that gripped British North America in 1735, we have to look at what the medical world looked like back then. This was a time long before the discovery of germs, bacteria, or viruses. When this epidemic struck, local physicians were completely baffled. In historical records, they scrambled to give it a name, calling it the throat ail, putrid sore throat, Sinenki, or simply the throat distemper. The progression of the disease was agonizingly predictable. It started with a lost appetite, a rising fever, and a severe sore throat. But within 48 hours, the true horror revealed itself. A mysterious, thick, leathery, ash-gray substance began to grow inside the patient's throat. It coated the tonsils, the nose, and the windpipe. It wasn't just fluid. It was a tough, fibrous membrane that anchored itself to the living tissue. As it grew, it literally barricaded the airway. The victims would develop a harsh, barking, croup-like cough, desperately trying to clear their throats. But they couldn't. With their small airways, young children stood almost no chance. They were awake, conscious, and completely aware as they slowly choked to death from the inside out. The fear was so suffocating that parents began rushing their healthy infants to churches for early emergency baptisms. They were racing against time, trying to save their children's souls before the undertaker arrived. Without any knowledge of modern medicine, the colonists looked for answers in the only places they knew: their faith and the natural world around them. Because the disease spread so rapidly through communities, people assumed it was carried by some occult quality in the air. Ministers took to their pulpits, delivering fiery sermons claiming the epidemic was God's righteous vengeance for the sins of the colonies. Pamphlets and 17-page poems, like Awakening Calls to Early Piety, were published and distributed, warning parents that their children were being targeted because the community had turned away from the church. But in towns like Newbury, Massachusetts, a bizarre alternative theory emerged. That very same summer, the region experienced a massive, unprecedented explosion in the caterpillar population. Millions of noxious caterpillars covered the roads, swarmed the houses, and stripped the trees bare. They even floated across streams in massive blankets. When carriage wheels rolled down the streets, they crushed so many insects that the wheels became slick and slippery from the residue. The colonists became convinced that these strange, overwhelming swarms were directly linked to the throat distemper. When a massive town prayer and sermon seemed to make the caterpillars disappear, the people thought they were saved, only to watch the throat distemper continue its relentless march down the Old Bay Path toward Boston. If the disease was terrifying, the medical treatments of the 18th century were arguably worse. Most colonial doctors still operated under the ancient theory of the four humors. They believed that illness was caused by an imbalance of bodily fluids. To treat the throat distemper, the Boston Gazette published official medical advice for frantic parents. Doctors would perform bloodletting, often directly under the child's tongue, weakening an already suffocating patient. They applied blistering plasters to the neck, administered harsh chemicals to induce vomiting, and forced patients to swallow toxic herbal concoctions made of plants like devil's bit. None of it worked. What makes the Great Throat Distemper of 1735 one of the strangest chapters in history is how it almost vanished from our collective memory. Despite being the deadliest epidemic relative to population size in colonial New England history, it is rarely mentioned in standard history textbooks. Historians have discovered that the loss was so sudden and so profoundly devastating that the survivors underwent a form of voluntary collective silence. Parents who lost every single one of their children simply packed up, abandoned their homes, and moved away to start over, leaving behind a historical record defined by an unspeakable, grieving silence. It would take nearly a century for science to finally unmask the strangling angel. In 1821, a French physician named Pierre Bretonneau studied the disease and finally gave it a permanent name based on its most horrifying symptom. He called it diphtheria, known today as diphtheria, derived from the Greek word for leather. It was a direct reference to that deadly, leathery buildup of dead tissue that choked its victims. Today, we know that diphtheria is caused by a highly contagious bacterium called Corynebacterium diphtheriae. It spreads through respiratory droplets, a cough, a sneeze, or even a shared cup. In 1735, the isolated settlements of New Hampshire and Massachusetts had absolutely no natural immunity to this specific strain, creating a perfect storm for near total mortality among children. The nightmare that terrorized New England wasn't solved by bleeding tongues or burning caterpillars. It was solved in the 1920s with the widespread implementation of the diphtheria vaccine. Because of modern immunization, a disease that once could empty a schoolhouse in a single week has become a rare relic of the past in most parts of the world. But the old graveyards of New England still stand as a quiet reminder of 1735, when an invisible angel walked among the colonies and left a generation of parents in total, heartbroken silence.